I remember the night Emeka told me his secret. We were sitting in his lavish apartment in Ikoyi, a place that smelled of expensive cologne and polished leather. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and for the first time I noticed how pale Emeka looked, how his once sharp eyes were now sunken and filled with something I couldn't name. "They want her," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They said it's her, or everything I've built." "Who?" I asked, leaning forward. I needed to understand what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" He didn't look at me. Instead, he stared at a photo on the glass coffee table, a picture of his mother, Mama Uzoamaka, smiling brightly in front of their old village house. His hands trembled as he picked it up. "I thought I could handle it," he said. "I thought I could make them stop." The room grew cold then, as if something unseen was listening. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, there was a soft knock on the door. Just one, and in that moment, I realized that whatever Emeka had gotten himself into, it was far beyond anything I could help him with. When Emeka left Umuofia for Lagos, the entire village came out to see him off. He was their pride and joy, the boy who had worked so hard to graduate secondary school with honors. His mother, Mama Uzoamaka, was especially proud. She had sold her only piece of farmland to fund his journey, telling everyone who would listen, "My son will make it. He'll bring honor to our family." Emeka had promised her he would. The road to Lagos was long and bumpy, and by the time Emeka arrived at the bustling motor park in Ojuelegba, he was already overwhelmed. The city was unlike anything he had imagined, loud, chaotic, and teeming with people. Hawkers shouted prices for their goods. Danfo buses sped recklessly through traffic, and the air smelled of roasted corn, petrol fumes, and sweat. But Emeka wasn't discouraged. He was determined to make it. At first, he stayed with a distant cousin in a small, overcrowded apartment in Ajegunle. The room was shared by 5 other men, all of whom were also hustling to survive. Emeka quickly learned that Lagos wasn't a place for dreamers. It was a place for hustlers, for people willing to grind every day just to make ends meet. His first job was as a street hawker, selling belts and phone chargers in traffic. He would wake up before dawn, grab a tray of goods from a supplier, and spend the day weaving through cars, shouting prices at impatient drivers. It was exhausting work, and the profits were meager, barely enough to buy food. When that failed, Emeka tried driving a keke, tricycle. It seemed like a good idea at first, but after an accident left the keke damaged, Emeka was left with more debt than he could handle. Each failure chipped away at his confidence, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. He had promised his mother he would succeed. Eventually, Emeka found work as a security guard at a nightclub in Ikeja. The job paid just enough for him to rent a small room of his own, a cramped space with peeling walls and a single bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping on the floor of his cousin's apartment. Still, Emeka couldn't help but feel like a failure. Every Sunday, he called his mother, and her voice was always filled with hope. "Don't worry, my son," she would say. "God's time is the best." Her words gave him strength, but they also filled him with guilt. She had sacrificed so much for him, and yet he had nothing to show for it. It was one of those Lagos nights that never seemed to end. The air was humid, thick with the smell of sweat and fried plantain from the nearby street vendors. The line outside the nightclub stretched far down the block, the crowd buzzing with the kind of excitement that only came alive after sundown. Emeka was stationed at the entrance, his job to manage the chaos, checking IDs, directing patrons, and making sure the wrong people didn't slip through. It had become routine for him by now. He had learned to tune out the loud music thumping from inside, the drunken laughter, and the constant honking of cars trying to squeeze into the already crowded street. But that night, something broke through the monotony. A sleek, black Mercedes-Benz pulled up to the curb, its engine purring softly like a panther waiting to strike. The car gleamed under the streetlights, spotless and intimidating, the kind of vehicle that made heads turn. Emeka, out of habit, straightened his back, adjusting his uniform as the driver's door swung open, and then he froze. The man who stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a navy blue suit that fit him so perfectly it could have been painted on. His shoes gleamed like polished obsidian, and a gold watch on his wrist caught the light, flashing like a signal to anyone watching. This man has arrived. But it wasn't the man's appearance that shocked Emeka. It was his face. Chuka? Emeka's voice came out barely above a whisper, as if his mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. The man turned, his movements deliberate and smooth, like someone who was used to being noticed. When his eyes met Emeka's, there was a moment of confusion, followed by recognition. "Emeka," he exclaimed, his lips breaking into a wide grin. His voice carried the same warmth and energy Emeka remembered from their childhood, though now it was layered with confidence and authority. "Chuka," Emeka repeated, his shock giving way to excitement. He stepped forward, reaching out for a handshake, but Chuka pulled him into a firm hug instead. "Look at you," Chuka said, stepping back to take a better look at his old friend. "It's been what, 7 years? 8? Almost 10, Emeka said, laughing nervously. He couldn't stop his eyes from darting to the car Chuka had just stepped out of. It was unlike anything he had ever seen up close, sleek, expensive, a symbol of a life he had only dreamed about. Chuka followed his gaze and smirked. "You like it?" he asked, nodding toward the car. It's incredible," Emeka admitted. "Is it yours?" Chuka chuckled, the sound deep and self-assured. "Of course it's mine. You think I'd rent something like this?" Emeka laughed, though his heart clenched with envy. The Chuka he remembered was just like him, a village boy with big dreams, but no clear path to achieve them. Yet here he was now, standing in front of Emeka, wearing wealth and success like a second skin. "What about you?" Chuka asked, his eyes flicking to Emeka's security uniform. "What are you doing here?" Emeka felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. "I work here," he said, gesturing toward the nightclub. "It's just temporary." "Temporary," Chuka repeated, his tone neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of pity. He nodded slowly, as if processing what Emeka had said. "Well, at least you're working. Lagos isn't an easy place to survive." "It's not," Emeka agreed quickly, grateful for the reassurance, though it did little to ease the knot in his chest. Chuka's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen briefly before slipping it back. "I have to go inside," he said, "but we need to catch up properly. Give me your number." Emeka fumbled in his pocket for his phone, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't been this nervous in years. After exchanging numbers, Chuka clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll call you," Chuka said. "We have a lot to talk about." And with that, he disappeared into the club, leaving Emeka standing there, his mind racing. For the rest of the night, Emeka couldn't concentrate on his work. His thoughts kept returning to Chuka, the car, the suit, the watch, the way he carried himself like someone who had conquered the world. It was almost too much to process. How had Chuka gone from the dusty fields of Umofia to this? The last time Emeka had seen him, they were both just boys, sitting under the mango tree after school and dreaming of the future. Chuka had always been the bold one, the one with big ideas and an even bigger mouth. But dreams were one thing, and reality was another. Now, Chuka was living the kind of life Emeka had promised himself he would achieve when he first came to Lagos. A life of comfort, power, and respect. Seeing Chuka like this only magnified Emeka's own struggles. He thought of his cramped room in Ajegunle, the peeling paint on the walls, the nights he went to bed hungry because he couldn't afford a proper meal. It wasn't jealousy he felt. It was something deeper, a gnawing sense of inadequacy that left a bitter taste in his mouth. For years he had told himself that his time would come, that hard work and persistence would eventually pay off. But seeing Chuka had shattered that illusion. Maybe hard work wasn't enough. Maybe there was another way. True to his word, Chuka called Emeka the very next day. "Emeka, my guy!" Chuka's voice boomed through the phone, warm and full of energy. "Are you free tonight? Let's meet up." Emeka hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face Chuka again, to sit across from him and pretend he wasn't drowning in his own failures. But curiosity got the better of him. He needed to know how Chuka had done it, how he had transformed his life so completely. "I'm free," Emeka said finally. "Good, I'll pick you up at 8. By the time Chuka's black Mercedes-Benz pulled up outside Emeka's building that evening, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with curiosity. The sleek car stood out like a king among paupers on the crowded, dusty street, drawing the attention of passers-by and neighbors alike. "Emeka, who's this your big man friend?" one of his neighbors called out from her stall where she sold roasted corn. Her tone was playful, but the question carried an undertone of envy. Emeka ignored her, stepping quickly toward the car. Chuka was leaning casually against the driver's door, his suit impeccably tailored, his shoes shining even in the dim glow of the streetlights. "Ready?" Chuka asked, flashing his signature grin. "Ready," Emeka replied, though his heart was racing. He was nervous, unsure of what tonight would bring. The car's interior smelled of leather and something faintly woody, like cologne that cost more than Emeka's monthly salary. As they drove, Chuka fiddled with the controls, and soft jazz music filled the cabin. It was a far cry from the rattling Danfo buses Emeka was used to, where you had to shout over the noise just to hear yourself think. "So," Chuka began, glancing at Emeka as he maneuvered through the traffic with ease, "how has life been treating you, my brother?" Emeka hesitated. What was he supposed to say? That he spent his days barely scraping by, living a life that felt more like survival than living. "It's been okay," he said finally, though he could hear the lack of conviction in his own voice. Chuka laughed, shaking his head. "You don't have to lie to me, Emeka. I know Lagos can be hell, but that's why I want to show you something tonight. Something that will change the way you see this city." Emeka's curiosity deepened, but he didn't press for details. He decided to let Chuka reveal things in his own time. They drove for what felt like hours, leaving behind the chaos of Ajegunle and entering the quiet, polished streets of Victoria Island. Emeka stared out the window, mesmerized by the stark contrast between this part of Lagos and where he lived. The roads were wide and smooth, lined with palm trees, and the buildings were towering and pristine, their glass windows reflecting the golden glow of streetlights. "Welcome to where the real Lagosians live," Chuka said with a smirk. Emeka said nothing, but his mind was racing. He had always heard about this side of Lagos, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. This wasn't the Lagos of struggle and hustle. This was the Lagos of wealth, power, and unimaginable luxury. They pulled up to a gated compound, and as the security guard waved them in, Emeka caught a glimpse of the mansion beyond the gates. It was massive, its walls painted a soft cream color, with large glass windows and balconies that overlooked a perfectly manicured garden. "Is this your house?" Emeka asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "One of them," Chuka replied casually, as if owning multiple mansions was no big deal. Emeka felt a pang of envy mixed with disbelief. This was a level of success he had never even dared to dream about. The interior of the house was even more impressive. The floors were made of polished marble that gleamed under the soft lighting, and the walls were adorned with abstract paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved from dark wood. "Make yourself comfortable," Chuka said, leading Emeka into a spacious living room, where a large sectional couch faced a massive flat-screen TV. A glass coffee table sat in the center, its surface so clean it reflected the ceiling lights. Emeka sat down tentatively, feeling out of place in such an extravagant setting. Chuka disappeared for a moment and returned with 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Emeka. "To old friends," Chuka said, raising his glass. "To old friends," Emeka echoed, though his mind was still trying to process everything he had seen. As they drank, Chuka began talking about his life in Lagos. He spoke about the parties, the connections, the opportunities that had come his way. It all sounded like a dream, and Emeka couldn't help but feel both inspired and disheartened. "How did you do it?" Emeka asked finally, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "How did you go from the village to this?" Chuka leaned back in his seat, studying Emeka with a thoughtful expression. "It's not an easy question to answer," he said. "Let's just say Lagos rewards those who know how to play the game." "What game?" Emeka pressed. Chuka smiled, but there was something guarded about it. "You'll see." After finishing their drinks, Chuka suggested they go out. "I want to show you how the other half lives," he said, his grin widening. "You've been working at that club for too long. It's time for you to see what real nightlife looks like." They drove to a rooftop lounge in the heart of Victoria Island, a place so exclusive that there was no sign outside, just a plain black door guarded by 2 bouncers in suits. Chuka exchanged a few words with one of them, and they were let in without question. The lounge was unlike anything Emeka had ever seen. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city's skyline. Soft, ambient music played in the background, and the air was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and cigars. The crowd was a mix of well-dressed men and glamorous women, all laughing and sipping from crystal glasses. Chuka led Emeka to a private table, where a waiter immediately appeared to take their order. "Whatever my friend wants," Chuka said, waving dismissively. "Put it on my tab." Emeka hesitated, unsure of what to say. He felt out of place here, like a boy pretending to be a man. But Chuka's confidence was infectious, and soon Emeka found himself relaxing, sipping a cocktail he couldn't pronounce and listening to Chuka's stories about life at the top. "This could be your life too," Chuka said at one point, leaning closer. "But you have to be willing to take risks." "What kind of risks?" Emeka asked, his curiosity now fully piqued. Chuka smiled again, that same guarded smile that seemed to hide more than it revealed. "You'll find out soon enough." By the time they returned to Chuka's mansion, it was past midnight, but Emeka was wide awake. His mind was racing with thoughts of everything he had seen: the luxury, the power, the ease with which Chuka moved through life. As he lay on the couch in Chuka's guest room that night, he couldn't help but wonder, was this really within his reach? Could he escape the life of struggle and finally give his mother the life she deserved? He had to know more. He had to know what Chuka's secret was. The call came just as Emeka was settling into his nightly routine, a simple dinner of noodles cooked on his small stove, eaten while sitting on the edge of his bed. His mother's name flashed on the cracked screen of his phone, and he answered quickly, his voice warm despite the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. "Mama," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "How are you?" But the voice that came through wasn't her usual cheerful tone. It was strained, weak, and riddled with pauses. "Emeka," she began, coughing lightly, "I don't want to worry you, but—" The rest of her words dissolved into a blur. Something about chest pains, difficulty breathing, and a visit to the village clinic. Emeka sat frozen, his grip tightening on the phone as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. "The doctor says I need surgery," she finished, her voice trembling. "But it's expensive, too expensive." "How much, Mama?" Emeka asked, already dreading the answer. When she told him the amount, his stomach dropped. It was far beyond anything he could hope to afford, even if he worked non-stop for months. He tried to reassure her, forcing confidence into his voice that he didn't feel. "Don't worry, Mama. I'll find the money," he said. "You'll be fine." But as he ended the call and stared at the dark walls of his room, a crushing weight settled on his chest. He had no savings, no assets to sell, and no one to turn to, except Chuka. The next morning, Emeka found himself sitting across from Chuka in the same luxurious living room that had left him in awe just days before. But this time, awe had been replaced by desperation. Chuka was reclined on the couch, his legs crossed, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup. "Let me get this straight," Chuka said, setting his cup down on the glass table. "You want to borrow money from me?" "Yes," Emeka said, his hands clasped tightly together. "My mother, she's sick. She needs surgery, and I can't afford it. Please, Chuka, I'll pay you back. I swear." Chuka tilted his head, studying Emeka with an expression that was difficult to read. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that made Emeka flinch. "Borrow money," Chuka repeated, shaking his head. "Emeka, you're thinking too small." "What do you mean?" Emeka asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not going to lend you money," Chuka said, leaning forward. "I'm going to teach you how to get rich, rich enough that you'll never have to beg anyone for anything again." Emeka's heart sank. He didn't have time for lessons or schemes. His mother needed help now. "Chuka, I don't need to be rich," he said, his voice breaking. "I just need to save my mother. And I'm telling you, this is how you save her," Chuka replied, his tone calm but firm. "Come with me tonight. I'll show you how I did it." That night, Emeka found himself sitting in Chuka's car as they drove through the quiet streets of Lekki. The neighborhoods grew darker and quieter as they left the main roads behind, the houses hidden behind tall gates and thick hedges. Eventually, they pulled up in front of a plain, unmarked building. "What is this place?" Emeka asked, his unease growing. Chuka didn't answer. He simply stepped out of the car and nodded for Emeka to follow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense, and the dim lighting cast long shadows on the walls. The space was vast and empty, save for a circle of men sitting around a central altar, their faces hidden by dark hoods. "Welcome," one of the men said, his voice deep and resonant. "You must be Emeka." Emeka glanced at Chuka, his heart pounding. "Who are these people?" he whispered. "They're the ones who can give you everything you've ever wanted," Chuka replied. "We call them the Brotherhood." The man at the altar gestured for Emeka to step forward. "Are you ready to change your life?" he asked. Emeka hesitated. The room felt wrong, the air heavy and oppressive. He took a step back, shaking his head. "I can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. Chuka's expression darkened. "Emeka, don't be foolish. Do you know how many people would kill to be in your position right now?" "I'm sorry," Emeka said, turning toward the door. "I can't." He ran out of the building, his heart racing as he stumbled into the night. He didn't stop until he reached the main road, where he flagged down a taxi and sank into the back seat, trembling. For the next few days, Emeka tried to focus on finding another way to raise the money for his mother's surgery. He called every contact he could think of, pleaded with old friends, and even tried to negotiate an advance from his employer. But every door he knocked on remained firmly shut. Meanwhile, his mother's condition worsened. Her voice on the phone grew weaker, each conversation punctuated by long pauses as she struggled to catch her breath. "Emeka," she said one evening, her voice barely audible, "don't worry about me. If it's my time, then so be it." Her words broke something inside him. He couldn't let her die. He couldn't. That night, as he lay awake in his tiny room, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he thought about Chuka's words. Do you know how many people would kill to be in your position? Emeka sat up, his jaw clenched. He didn't have a choice. If this was the only way to save his mother, then so be it. The next morning, Emeka showed up at Chuka's mansion, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Chuka opened the door, his expression cold. "I thought I made myself clear," Chuka said. "If you're not willing to do what it takes, don't come to me for help." "I'm ready," Emeka said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." Chuka studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good," he said. "You'll thank me for this one day." The drive to the unmarked building in Lekki felt different this time. Emeka sat in Chuka's car, his hands gripping his knees, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and desperation. The smooth hum of the Mercedes-Benz's engine should have been comforting, but instead, it amplified the tension in his chest. He didn't dare look at Chuka, who was calm as ever, humming along to a soft jazz tune playing on the radio. "Relax, my brother," Chuka said, without taking his eyes off the road. "This is the beginning of your new life." Emeka wanted to believe him. He wanted to trust that this decision, this terrifying leap into the unknown, was the right one. But his mother's weak voice echoed in his mind, urging him forward. "You're doing this for her," he told himself. "You don't have a choice." When they arrived, the building was just as unsettling as before, plain, unmarked, and shrouded in an eerie silence. This time, however, Emeka didn't hesitate. He followed Chuka inside, his heart pounding like a drum. The room was exactly as he remembered, dimly lit, thick with the scent of incense and dominated by the circle of hooded men sitting around the central altar. The air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating, as though the room itself were alive. Chuka placed a reassuring hand on Emeka's shoulder. "Just follow my lead," he said. One of the men rose from the circle and stepped forward. His presence was commanding, his voice deep and steady. "Emeka Nwosu," he said, addressing him directly. "You've returned. Are you ready to commit yourself to the Brotherhood?" Emeka swallowed hard. His voice felt trapped in his throat, but he managed to nod. "Yes," he said quietly. "You must speak with conviction," the man said sharply. "Are you ready to commit yourself to the Brotherhood?" "Yes," Emeka repeated, louder this time. The man nodded, satisfied. "Step forward." Emeka obeyed, his legs feeling like they might give out beneath him. As he approached the altar, he saw it more clearly now. A stone slab adorned with strange carvings, surrounded by candles that flickered as though reacting to his presence. On the altar lay a small bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Drink," the man instructed, gesturing to the bowl. Emeka hesitated, staring at the liquid. It smelled metallic, almost like blood, and its surface shimmered unnaturally in the candlelight. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It is your passage," the man replied, "a symbol of your willingness to leave your old life behind and embrace the new." Chuka stepped closer, his expression firm. "This is it, Emeka. This is the moment. Think of your mother. Think of what you're doing this for." The mention of his mother jolted Emeka into action. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and lifted the bowl to his lips. The liquid was bitter and thick, sliding down his throat like sludge. He gagged but forced himself to swallow, determined not to falter. As soon as he finished, a strange warmth spread through his body, starting in his chest and radiating outward. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. Then, everything went black. When Emeka opened his eyes, he was no longer in the room. He was standing in a vast open field under a blood-red sky. The ground beneath his feet was dry and cracked, and the air was heavy with the sound of whispers, soft, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice, a voice that was deep and otherworldly, speaking in a language Emeka didn't understand. He spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing but the endless field. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinct, but its presence overwhelming. Emeka felt a wave of fear wash over him, freezing him in place. "Do you seek wealth?" the figure asked, its voice echoing inside Emeka's head. "Yes," Emeka replied, his voice barely audible. "Do you understand the price?" Emeka hesitated. "What price?" The figure leaned closer, its form shifting like smoke. "Everything has a cost. Are you prepared to pay it?" Emeka thought of his mother, lying in that small village clinic, waiting for a miracle. He thought of the life he had always dreamed of giving her, the promises he had made. "Yes," he said finally, "I'm prepared." The figure seemed to smile, though its face remained featureless. "Then it is done." Emeka woke with a start, gasping for air. He was back in the room, lying on the cold stone floor. The hooded men were still seated in their circle, their expressions unreadable. Chuka knelt beside him, his hand on Emeka's shoulder. "You did well," Chuka said, smiling. "Welcome to the Brotherhood." Emeka sat up slowly, his head spinning. What happens now?" "Now," the leader of the group said, his voice cutting through the silence, "you will begin to reap the rewards of your commitment. But remember, Emeka, wealth is not given freely. It must be maintained, and the price must always be paid." The days that followed were unlike anything Emeka had ever experienced. It began with a call from a company he had never applied to, offering him a job as a project manager with a salary that seemed almost too good to be true. A week later, he received a mysterious deposit in his bank account, enough to pay for his mother's surgery and then some. He sent the money to the clinic immediately, and when he called his mother to tell her the news, her voice was filled with relief and gratitude. "God bless you, my son," she said. "You've saved me." Emeka hung up the phone, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time in years, he felt like he was winning. But even as the money poured in and his life began to transform, there was a lingering unease. At night, when the city was quiet, he would hear them, the whispers. Faint at first, but growing louder with each passing day. "Do not forget the price," they said. At first, Emeka dismissed the whispers as exhaustion. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him after all the stress he had endured. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers became harder to ignore. They started at night, just as he was drifting off to sleep. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes, they sounded like they were outside his window, other times right by his ear. They weren't words he could understand, but they carried an ominous weight that made his skin crawl. "Do not forget the price," they would eventually say, their tone low and almost mournful. During the day, the whispers faded, replaced by the overwhelming noise of his new life. Emeka was no longer a struggling security guard. He was now the project manager of a high-profile construction firm overseeing multi-million naira projects. He had moved out of his tiny room in Ajegunle and into a sleek apartment in Lekki, complete with a balcony that offered a view of the ocean. His mother had successfully undergone her surgery and was recovering well. She called him almost every day, her voice filled with joy and pride. "My son, you're a blessing," she said one afternoon. "I pray that God continues to lift you higher." Hearing her happiness made Emeka feel as though the whispers didn't matter. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had saved his mother and transformed his life. But deep down, he knew that this newfound success wasn't without its cost. One night, as Emeka sat on his balcony, sipping a glass of wine, his phone buzzed. It was Chuka. "How's my newest success story?" Chuka asked, his tone light and jovial. "I'm good," Emeka replied, though he couldn't hide the hesitation in his voice. Chuka picked up on it immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. "It's nothing," Emeka said quickly. "Just tired from work." Chuka laughed. "You're not tired, my brother. You're adjusting. This is what happens when you step into the big leagues." "Do you ever hear them?" Emeka blurted out before he could stop himself. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Chuka finally spoke, his tone was calm but serious. "The whispers." Emeka's breath caught in his throat. "So you do hear them?" "Of course," Chuka said. "We all do. It's part of the deal." "What do they want?" Emeka asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're just reminders," Chuka replied, "to keep you focused, to make sure you never forget who helped you get here." "But what happens if I ignore them?" There was a long silence, and Emeka thought Chuka might have ended the call. Then, finally, Chuka spoke, his tone cold. "You don't ignore them, Emeka. You don't even think about ignoring them." The line went dead. Over the next few weeks, the whispers grew more frequent. They began to follow Emeka into the daylight hours, faint at first, but gradually becoming louder. They would echo in his office while he reviewed blueprints, whisper to him in traffic as he drove home, and haunt him in the quiet moments when he was alone. One night, he awoke to find his room bathed in an eerie, flickering light. At first, he thought it was the glow from his bedside lamp, but when he looked closer, he saw shadows dancing on the walls. Shadows that didn't match any object in the room. They moved erratically, twisting and contorting as though they had a life of their own. "Do not forget the price," the whispers said again, louder this time. Emeka sat frozen in his bed, sweat pouring down his face. He tried to block out the sound, covering his ears with his hands, but it was no use. The voices were inside him, woven into the very fabric of his thoughts. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. And just like that, the shadows disappeared and the room fell silent. But Emeka knew this was only the beginning. The breaking point came one evening when Emeka received a call from his mother. Her voice, usually so strong and full of life, sounded weak and strained. "Emeka," she said, her tone laced with worry. "I've been feeling off lately. It's probably nothing, but the doctor wants me to come in for some tests." Emeka's chest tightened. "Mama, you just had surgery. You'll be fine," he said, trying to reassure her. But the unease in his gut told him otherwise. After the call, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time, they didn't just speak, they demanded. "The time has come," they said in unison, their voices a cacophony that filled the room. "The price must be paid." Emeka clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "What price?" he shouted. "What do you want from me?" But he already knew the answer. The next morning, Chuka showed up at Emeka's apartment unannounced. He was dressed casually, but his expression was grave. Without saying a word, he handed Emeka a piece of paper. Written on it was a single name, Mama Uzoamaka. "No," Emeka said, shaking his head violently. "You can't be serious." "This is the price, Emeka," Chuka said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You knew this was coming." "I didn't know it would be her," Emeka shouted, his voice breaking. "She's all I have, Chuka. I can't—" Chuka interrupted him, his tone sharp. "Do you think you're the first person to feel this way? Do you think you're special? This is the cost of wealth, Emeka. You said you'd do anything. Now it's time to prove it." Emeka sank into his chair, his mind racing. He had always known there would be a price, but he had never imagined it would be this. His mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, was now the target of the deal he had made. "I can't do it," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I can't." Chuka's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "If you don't, Emeka, everything you've gained will be taken from you. Your wealth, your success, your life. And trust me, the Brotherhood doesn't take kindly to debts that go unpaid." Emeka didn't leave his apartment for 2 days after Chuka handed him the paper with his mother's name. He couldn't bring himself to eat, sleep, or even answer his phone. His mind raced endlessly, replaying Chuka's words and the whispers that had haunted him since the initiation. The price must be paid, they had said. But why his mother? Why the one person who had given everything to ensure he had a chance at life? On the 3rd day, Emeka called his mother. She picked up almost immediately, her warm voice as comforting as ever. "Emeka, my son," she said, a hint of excitement in her tone. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Mama," he lied, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to hear your voice." "You sound tired," she said. "Are you eating well? You know Lagos can drain you if you're not careful." Emeka wanted to break down right there, to tell her everything and beg for her forgiveness. But he couldn't. He couldn't risk her knowing the truth about the deal he had made, the dark forces that were now circling their lives. "I'm fine, Mama," he said again, his voice steadier this time. "I'll come to visit you soon." "That would make me so happy," she said, her voice soft. "I've been praying for you, my son. God will continue to guide you." Emeka ended the call and stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. Her voice, her warmth, her unwavering faith in him, it only made the decision he faced more unbearable. That night, Emeka went to Chuka's mansion, desperate for another way out. Chuka greeted him at the door, his expression unreadable. "I thought you'd come sooner," Chuka said, stepping aside to let Emeka in. Emeka walked into the lavish living room, the opulence of it all now feeling more suffocating than impressive. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice pleading. "Anything but this. Please, Chuka." Chuka sighed and sat across from him, leaning back in his chair. "You don't understand how this works, do you?" he said. "The Brotherhood doesn't deal in favors. They deal in exchanges. You want wealth, power, and success, then you give something in return, something valuable." "But she's my mother," Emeka said, his voice rising. "She's all I have. And that's exactly why she's the price," Chuka replied, his tone cold. "Do you think they ask for things that don't matter? They want what's precious to you. That's the deal." Emeka buried his face in his hands, shaking his head. "There has to be another way," he whispered. "There isn't," Chuka said firmly. "You made your choice the day you drank from that bowl. Now you either pay the price or you lose everything." Over the next few days, Emeka felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him like never before. The whispers that had once been faint and sporadic now followed him constantly, growing louder and more insistent. "Time is running out," they said, their voices echoing in his mind. "The price must be paid." Everywhere he went, he felt their presence. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, unnatural and out of place. At night, he would wake to find his room filled with an oppressive darkness, the air so heavy it felt like he couldn't breathe. One evening, as he sat on his balcony staring at the city lights, he felt a cold breeze sweep past him, even though the air was still. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Then he heard it, a single voice, clearer than any of the whispers before. "She is the key," it said. "Without her, all is lost." Emeka stood abruptly, knocking over his glass of wine. His chest tightened as the realization hit him. The Brotherhood wasn't going to wait much longer. He had to make a decision. The next morning, Emeka received another call from his mother. Her voice was weaker than before, and she sounded out of breath. "Emeka," she said, her tone strained. "The doctor wants me to come back for more tests. They think something might be wrong with my heart." Emeka clenched his jaw, his heart breaking at the sound of her suffering. "Don't worry, Mama," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "I'll handle everything." After ending the call, Emeka sat in silence for a long time. He thought about the life he had built, the wealth and success that had seemed so unattainable just months ago. He thought about his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, and he thought about the Brotherhood, the deal he had made, and the price they demanded. By the time the sun set that evening, Emeka had made his decision. That night, Emeka called Chuka. "I'm ready," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Chuka didn't ask for clarification. He didn't need to. "Come to the building," he said. "You know where it is." When Emeka arrived, the air around the unmarked building felt colder than usual. The whispers that had haunted him for weeks now seemed to hum with approval, as though they knew what he was about to do. Inside, the room was exactly as he remembered, dimly lit, heavy with the scent of incense, and dominated by the circle of hooded men. Chuka stood near the altar, his expression unreadable. "Emeka Nwosu," the leader of the group said, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. "Have you come to fulfill your obligation?" Emeka stepped forward, his legs trembling, but his resolve firm. "I have," he said. The leader nodded, gesturing to the altar. "Place the name." Emeka reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it, revealing the name he had written just hours earlier, Mama Uzwamaka. With a heavy heart, he placed the paper on the altar. The room grew colder, and the whispers rose into a crescendo, their voices merging into a single, chilling chant. The price is paid. When Emeka left the unmarked building that night, the world felt different. The air was still, almost too still, and the usual cacophony of Lagos seemed muted, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The whispers were gone, but their absence didn't bring relief. It left a void that was filled with dread. Chuka drove him home in silence, the tension between them palpable. Emeka kept his eyes on the road ahead, refusing to meet Chuka's gaze. He felt hollow, like a part of him had been stripped away. "You did what you had to do," Chuka said finally, breaking the silence. His tone was calm, almost indifferent. "This is the price of success, Emeka. It's not meant to be easy." Emeka didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was consumed by thoughts of his mother, of the name he had placed on the altar, and of the unknown consequences that were now set in motion. The next morning, Emeka's phone rang. He stared at the screen for a moment, his heart pounding when he saw his mother's name. With trembling hands, he picked up. "Mama," he said, his voice shaky, "how are you feeling?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Emeka thought the call had dropped. Then his mother's voice came through, faint but clear. "I had the strangest dream last night," she said. "I was standing in a field, and there were people all around me, chanting. They kept saying something about a price." Emeka's blood ran cold. "A price?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes," she said, "but when I tried to ask them what they meant, they just disappeared. It was so strange." "It's nothing, Mama," Emeka said quickly, forcing a smile into his voice. "Just a bad dream. Don't think too much about it." His mother sighed. "Maybe you're right, but Emeka, I feel different today, lighter, almost, like something has changed." Emeka ended the call as quickly as he could, his hands trembling as he placed the phone on the table. He stared at it for a long time, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a boulder. The whispers were gone, the Brotherhood was silent, but Emeka knew deep down that the price was far from fully paid. For the next few days, Emeka threw himself into work, trying to drown out the guilt that gnawed at him. He buried himself in meetings, site visits, and paperwork, hoping that the chaos of his new life would distract him from the darkness lurking in the corners of his mind. But the signs were impossible to ignore. It started with small things. A strange coldness, that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Lights flickering in his apartment, even though there was no power outage. Shadows that seemed to move on their own, darting just out of sight when he turned his head. One evening, as Emeka stood on his balcony staring out at the city, he saw something that made his heart stop. Across the street, in the reflection of a glass building, he saw a figure standing behind him in his apartment. It was tall and shrouded in darkness, its form indistinct but unmistakable. Emeka spun around, but the room was empty. He backed away slowly, his breath coming in short gasps. The whispers might have been gone, but something far worse had taken their place. The call came a week later. It was from the doctor in the village clinic. "Mr. Nwosu," the doctor began, his tone cautious. "Your mother has been readmitted. Her condition has worsened." Emeka's chest tightened. "Worsened? How? She just had surgery." "I can't explain it," the doctor admitted. "Physically, she should be recovering well, but it's as if her body is shutting down, almost like she's fading." Emeka hung up without responding. He paced his apartment, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't natural. This was the price, the fulfillment of the deal he had made. His success had come at the cost of his mother's life, and now the Brotherhood's influence was taking its toll. The next day, Emeka took a flight to the village. The journey felt surreal, as though he were walking into a nightmare he couldn't escape. When he arrived at the clinic, he found his mother lying in bed, her once vibrant face pale and drawn. "Mama," he said, kneeling beside her. His voice cracked as he took her hand in his. "I'm here." She smiled weakly, her eyes barely opening. "My son," she whispered, "you're doing so well. I'm so proud of you." Emeka's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess the terrible choice he had made, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he sat with her, holding her hand as the hours passed. As night fell, Emeka noticed something strange. The room grew colder, and the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow pass over his mother's face. Her breathing grew shallow, and her hand went limp in his. "Mama," Emeka whispered, panic rising in his chest. Her eyes fluttered open one last time, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Sadness, love, and perhaps even understanding. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, and then she was gone. Back in Lagos, Emeka's life continued to flourish. The Brotherhood kept their promises. His wealth grew, his connections deepened, and his power in the city expanded. But none of it brought him peace. His mother's death haunted him, not just in his dreams, but in every aspect of his life. He couldn't look at his success without seeing her face, couldn't enjoy his wealth without hearing her voice. And then, one night, the whispers returned. "Do not forget," they said, their voices cold and unrelenting. "The price is never fully paid." The days after his mother's death passed in a haze. Emeka had returned to Lagos, but the city no longer felt the same. The once thrilling pace of life, the allure of wealth, and the satisfaction of success now felt hollow. Every room in his sleek Lekki apartment seemed too quiet, every luxury too extravagant. But he kept moving. He buried himself in work, attending meetings and networking events, signing deals, and making more money than he had ever dreamed possible. On the surface, he was thriving, but inside, the guilt was eating him alive. The whispers were back, louder and more relentless than ever. They came at all hours of the day, their voices now clear and commanding. "Do not forget the price," they said. "The debt is not yet paid." Emeka tried to ignore them, but the shadows that followed him wouldn't let him rest. He began to notice strange things. His reflection in the mirror lingering a moment too long, his shadow moving when he stood still, cold drafts in rooms with no windows open. But the worst was the dreams. One night, Emeka woke in a cold sweat. his heart pounding as though he had been running for miles. In his dream, he had been back in the Brotherhood's chamber, standing before the altar. The hooded figures surrounded him, their chants echoing in his ears. But this time, his mother was there too. She stood on the other side of the altar, her face pale and expressionless. She didn't speak, but her eyes, those once warm eyes that had always looked at him with love, now stared at him with something he couldn't bear to name. As the hooded figures chanted, the shadows around her grew darker and began to consume her. Emeka tried to move, to reach out to her, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. "Mama!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. When he woke, he found himself on the floor of his bedroom, the sheets tangled around his legs. The air in the room was cold, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the air. The next day, Emeka called Chuka. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "Is this about the whispers?" Chuka asked, his tone calm, but slightly annoyed. "You need to get used to them, Emeka. They're part of the deal." "It's not just the whispers," Emeka said. "I'm seeing things. Shadows. My mother. She came to me in a dream." Chuka sighed. "Emeka, listen to me. This isn't the time to lose focus. You're climbing higher every day. Don't let your mind play tricks on you." "But what if it's not just my mind?" Emeka pressed. "What if—" "Enough," Chuka interrupted sharply. "You're thinking too much. Focus on your work, and everything will be fine. The Brotherhood has given you everything you wanted. Don't start questioning it now." Emeka hung up, unsatisfied but unwilling to push further. Chuka had always seemed so sure of himself, so at ease with the life they were living. But Emeka couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. As the weeks passed, Emeka's unease only grew. The shadows that had once lingered at the edges of his vision now moved boldly, following him everywhere. He would see them in his office, slithering along the walls, and in his apartment, hovering in the corners of the room. One night, as he sat in his living room, staring at a glass of whiskey, he saw a figure standing just outside his balcony door. It was tall and indistinct, its outline shimmering like heat waves. Emeka froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Emeka grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door. When the light hit the glass, the figure vanished, but the whispers returned louder than ever. "The debt must be paid," they said. Emeka's breaking point came a week later. He had been avoiding his apartment, spending as much time as possible in the office or out at meetings, but the shadows followed him wherever he went. They no longer confined themselves to the corners. They now loomed over him, their presence so oppressive it felt like they were draining the very life out of him. One evening, as he sat in his office, long after his staff had gone home, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and Emeka's heart raced as he reached for his phone. But before he could turn on the flashlight, he heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallway outside. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Emeka stood, his phone shaking in his hand as he inched toward the door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. But just as he turned to go back inside, a cold breath grazed the back of his neck. "The price is never fully paid," a voice whispered in his ear. Emeka spun around, but there was nothing there. That night, Emeka called Chuka again. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice frantic. "They're everywhere, the shadows, the whispers. They won't leave me alone." Chuka sighed heavily. "Emeka, we've all been there. It's just the Brotherhood keeping you in line." "But it's not just whispers anymore," Emeka shouted. "They're in my apartment, my office, everywhere. I'm losing my mind, Chuka." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Chuka finally spoke. "There's one thing you can do," he said, his voice low. "But it's not easy." "What is it?" Emeka asked desperately. "You need to go back to the Brotherhood," Chuka said. "You need to renegotiate your terms." "Renegotiate," Emeka repeated, his heart sinking. "How do I do that?" "They won't make it easy," Chuka warned. "But if you're willing to give them something more valuable than what you've already given, they might let you go." Emeka's mind raced. What could be more valuable than his mother? What else could they possibly want? But even as the question lingered in his mind, he knew the answer. They wanted him. Emeka knew that returning to the Brotherhood would be the most dangerous decision of his life, but the whispers left him no choice. The shadows had become unbearable, following him even in his dreams. Every waking moment was filled with a suffocating weight, as though the walls of his own mind were closing in. On a cold, moonless night, Emeka found himself once again standing before the unmarked building in Lekki. It loomed before him like a dark sentinel, silent and foreboding. The air around it felt heavier than before, thick with an energy that sent chills down his spine. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of incense hit him immediately, mingling with the faint echoes of chanting from somewhere deep within. The room was just as he remembered, dimly lit, with the circle of hooded figures seated around the central altar. But this time there was no hesitation in Emeka's step. He walked straight to the center of the room, his head held high despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I need to renegotiate," he said, his voice trembling but firm. The hooded figures turned toward him in unison, their movements slow and deliberate. The leader, the one with the deep, commanding voice, rose from his seat. "Renegotiate," the leader repeated, his tone laced with disdain. "You do not come here to renegotiate, Emeka Nwosu. The deal was made. The price was paid." "But the debt isn't settled," Emeka said, his voice rising. "The whispers, the shadows, they won't leave me alone. I can't live like this." The leader stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And what makes you think you can alter the terms of our agreement?" Emeka swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the leader's gaze. "You said wealth comes at a price. I paid it. I gave you my mother. But if you want more, take me instead." The room fell silent, the air growing impossibly still. The hooded figures exchanged glances, their faces hidden in shadow. Then the leader laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the chamber. "You offer yourself?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you truly understand what you are saying?" "I do," Emeka replied, his voice steady now. "If that's what it takes to end this, then I'll do it." The leader tilted his head, as if considering Emeka's words. "Very well," he said finally. "But understand this. Once you give yourself to us, there is no going back. You will belong to the Brotherhood in body, mind, and soul. Do you accept these terms?" Emeka hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision crashing down on him. But then he thought of his mother, of the sacrifice she had made for him all her life. He couldn't let her death be in vain. "I accept," he said firmly. The leader gestured to the altar. "Then kneel." Emeka knelt before the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. The leader reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small dagger, its blade gleaming in the candlelight. He handed it to Emeka, who stared at it in confusion. "Blood seals all pacts," the leader said. "You must offer your own." Emeka took the dagger with trembling hands. Without hesitation, he pressed the blade to his palm and made a small cut, wincing as the sharp pain shot through him. Blood pooled in his hand, and he let it drip onto the altar, where it disappeared as though absorbed by the stone. The hooded figures began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. The air in the room grew colder, and the candles flickered wildly, casting strange shadows on the walls. As the chanting reached its peak, Emeka felt a sudden pull, like something deep inside him was being drawn out. He gasped, clutching his chest as the sensation grew stronger. It was as if his very essence was being siphoned away, leaving him hollow and weightless. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the feeling stopped. Emeka collapsed onto the altar, his vision swimming. The leader placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice calm and almost soothing. "It is done," he said. "You are now one with the Brotherhood." When Emeka woke, he was back in his apartment. At first, he thought it had all been a dream, but when he looked down at his hand, he saw the thin scar where he had cut himself, and he knew it was real. The whispers were gone. The shadows, too. For the first time in months, the air around him felt still and quiet. But something else had changed. As he stood in front of the mirror, Emeka noticed something strange about his reflection. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now darker, almost hollow. His skin seemed paler, his features sharper. He looked like himself, but not entirely. And then there was the voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear and loud, a voice that came from within him, echoing in his mind. "You are ours now, Emeka," it said. "Your wealth, your power, your life, they belong to us." Emeka stumbled back, clutching his head. The voice laughed, a deep chilling sound that sent shivers down his spine. As the weeks went on, Emeka's wealth and power continued to grow. He was promoted to a senior position in his company, awarded contracts that made him millions, and invited into the inner circles of Lagos's elite. On the surface, he was living the dream, but beneath it all, he was a prisoner. The voice never left him. It dictated his every move, whispering instructions and commands that he couldn't disobey. It reminded him constantly that he was no longer his own person, that his soul belongs to the Brotherhood. And then there were the dreams. Every night, he found himself back in the Brotherhood's chamber, surrounded by shadows and chanting figures. His mother was always there, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes accusing. One night, she spoke. "Was it worth it?" she asked, her voice echoing in the darkness. Emeka woke with tears streaming down his face. He couldn't answer her question, because deep down, he already knew the answer. Emeka's life had become a twisted contradiction. By day, he was a man of immense wealth and influence, a rising star in Lagos's elite circles. He moved effortlessly through boardrooms and exclusive parties, commanding respect and admiration wherever he went. Yet, by night, he was haunted by the weight of his choices, a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. The voice in his head was always there, cold and unrelenting. It whispered to him in moments of stillness, reminding him of his debt, his place, and the price he would continue to pay. "You are not free," it said one evening as Emeka sat on his balcony, staring at the glittering lights of the city. "You will never be free." The cracks in Emeka's composure began to show. At work, his colleagues noticed how distracted he had become, his once confident demeanor replaced by a nervous edge. He snapped at people for minor mistakes, his temper flaring without warning. "Are you okay, sir?" one of his assistants asked cautiously, after a particularly harsh outburst. "I'm fine," Emeka snapped, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "Just get out." At home, the shadows began to return. They no longer lingered at the edges of his vision. They now stood boldly in the corners of his rooms, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He tried to ignore them, to convince himself they weren't real, but the voice in his head always reminded him otherwise. "They are here for you," it said. "Do not forget your place." One evening, Emeka decided to attend a high-profile gala in Victoria Island, hoping the event would distract him from the chaos in his mind. The venue was lavish, filled with Lagos's wealthiest and most influential people. Men in tailored suits and women in flowing gowns sipped champagne as they mingled under chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. Emeka moved through the crowd, forcing a smile and exchanging pleasantries. But as the night went on, he began to feel a strange unease. It was as though the room had grown darker, the air heavier. And then he saw her. Across the room, standing near the grand staircase, was his mother. She wore the same simple wrapper and headscarf she had always worn in the village, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She stood motionless, staring directly at him. Emeka's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and she was gone. From that night on, Emeka's grip on reality began to slip. The visions of his mother became more frequent. He would see her reflection in mirrors, her face appearing briefly before disappearing again. He would hear her voice calling his name, soft and sorrowful, echoing through his apartment. "Mama?" he whispered one night, his voice shaking. "Is that you?" There was no response, only the sound of the wind outside his window. But as he turned to leave the room, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The voice in his head grew louder, more demanding. "You belong to us," it said. "Do not resist." Emeka began to avoid sleep, terrified of the dreams that awaited him. But the lack of rest only made the visions worse. He started seeing figures in the streets, hooded and shadowy, watching him from a distance. They never approached, but their presence was suffocating. In his desperation, Emeka decided to confront Chuka. He hadn't spoken to his old friend in weeks, and when he arrived at Chuka's mansion, he was surprised to find it dark and empty. The gates were locked, the windows shuttered. "Where is he?" Emeka muttered, his heart racing. He began asking around, contacting mutual acquaintances and even some of Chuka's business partners. But no one seemed to know where Chuka had gone. It was as though he had disappeared without a trace. "Be careful," one of Chuka's associates warned Emeka during a brief phone call. "People who get involved in certain things don't just vanish. There's always a reason." The words sent a chill through Emeka. If Chuka, who had always seemed so untouchable, could disappear, what hope did Emeka have? One night, as Emeka sat in his living room, the shadows around him seemed to grow darker, denser, until they filled the room completely. The voice in his head grew louder, echoing like thunder. "It is time," it said. "You cannot run from us." Emeka stood, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. "I've given you everything." The room fell silent, and then, in the center of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was his mother, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. "You gave them me," she said, her voice trembling. "And now they will take you." Emeka sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Mama, I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know." She stepped closer, her form flickering like a dying flame. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "The debt is never fully paid." As she spoke, the shadows closed in around Emeka, their cold tendrils wrapping around his body. He felt himself being pulled into the darkness, his screams swallowed by the void. The next morning, Emeka's apartment was empty. The staff who came to clean found no trace of him, only the faint scent of incense lingering in the air and a single handwritten note on the coffee table. "To whoever finds this, do not follow my path. Wealth is never worth the price." The story of Emeka's rise and fall spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones across Lagos and beyond. To those who had known him as a struggling young man, his sudden disappearance was as mysterious as his meteoric rise to wealth. For weeks, people speculated. Some said he had fled the country. Others believed he had been taken by enemies he'd made along the way. But the ones who knew him best, those who had glimpsed the shadows lurking around his success, suspected the truth. One of the first people to enter Emeka's empty apartment was Ifeoma, the cleaner who came every Monday morning. She had worked for Emeka for months, But that particular morning, as she stepped into his apartment, something felt off. "I knew something wasn't right as soon as I opened the door," she would later tell a neighbor. "The air was cold and it smelled strange, like incense and burnt wood." Ifeoma noticed immediately that the apartment was eerily clean, almost too clean. There were no dishes in the sink, no clothes on the floor, nothing to suggest that someone had lived there just the night before. But it was the note on the coffee table that sent chills down her spine. The handwriting was unmistakably Emeka's, neat but hurried. The words were simple yet haunting. "Do not follow my path. Wealth is never worth the price." Weeks after Emeka's disappearance, another piece of the puzzle emerged. A fisherman from a remote village along the Lagos Lagoon claimed to have found an abandoned car near the water's edge. It was sleek and black, its windows tinted so dark that even in broad daylight, nothing could be seen inside. The fisherman swore it was the same car he had seen on the news months earlier, belonging to a man named Chuka, who had also vanished without a trace. The car's interior, he said, smelled faintly of incense, and the driver's seat was covered in a fine layer of ash. No one ever saw or heard from Chuka again. Those who had dealings with Emeka or Chuka in their final days began to distance themselves from their memories. Business partners refused to speak about them. Employees moved on without asking questions, and the few friends who remained refused to entertain any stories of supernatural involvement. But among the whispers, one common thread emerged, a warning. Those who heard it often dismissed it as urban legend, but to those who had seen the shadows, it felt all too real. "They say the Brotherhood never lets you go," a man said one night at a bar in Victoria Island, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Once you make a deal with them, you belong to them. Even after you're gone, they find ways to collect." Months after Emeka's disappearance, an old woman from Umuofia village claimed to have seen something strange near Mama Uzoamaka's grave. It was a quiet evening, and she had gone to the burial ground to pay her respects to a relative. As she approached Mama Uzoamaka's headstone, she saw a man kneeling before it, his head bowed. At first, she thought it was a son mourning his mother, but as she got closer, she realized the figure wasn't entirely solid. It flickered like a shadow caught in the wind, and when it turned to look at her, its face was empty. No eyes, no mouth, just darkness. She ran from the graveyard, her screams echoing through the village. When others came to investigate, they found nothing but an unnatural chill lingering around the headstone. Over time, Emeka's story became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a legend. People in Lagos spoke of him in hushed tones, warning each other about the dangers of ambition unchecked by morality. In the crowded bars and bustling markets, the story always ended the same way. "No matter how much you want wealth," they would say, "never make a deal with the spirits, because the price is never fully paid." Years later, a young man working as a bartender in a high-end lounge claimed to have seen Emeka, or someone who looked just like him. The man was seated in a corner booth, dressed in an expensive suit, sipping whiskey. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, and his eyes had a strange, hollow quality. When the bartender approached to ask if he needed anything else, the man simply smiled and said, "Be careful what you wish for." By the time the bartender returned to the booth, the man was gone. The only trace of his presence was a faint scent of incense in the air.